So probably the biggest question, the biggest question mark, the biggest topic, the biggest inhibitor for adopting the cloud is security. Everybody is so weary about security, although all the security breaches that you've heard about in the media have all been against on-premises data centers and not against the cloud. And those that have been against the cloud have been because the tenant of the cloud didn't take the proper security measures to protect themselves. So what I'm here to tell you in a nutshell before we get into physical access is that there is no way we can build the security measures that cloud providers like Amazon and Azure and others have built in because of the sheer scale of things, because of their automation, because of everything they put into it. The advanced technology, the newest hardware, best practices that they follow, even their resources, their intellectual capital, their human capital that they have will be very, very difficult for us to match on premises. But let's take a look. Don't let me, I don't want to keep talking about it. Let's take a look. So from a physical access perspective, well, one of the most important things about data center is secrecy. Well, if you don't know where that data center is, and we're talking here physical access, there's no way you can attack that data center. So the first barrier is to identify where the Amazon Web Services data centers are if you're trying to physically try to get access. So because they don't advertise that, because it's a secret location, because there's so many of them, you would have to identify that actual data center. You would have to identify if the tenant that you're trying to hack is in that particular data center, which is the availability zone or the AZ zone. So before we get going here, what I want to say is if someone really wants to hack a system and they have the know-how, they'll be able to. Your job is to make it as difficult as possible for them to do that so that it's not worth it and they move on to other things. And that starts at every layer, even identifying the address of the data center. If they don't have that address, well, you've removed that risk altogether. But let's assume someone was able to identify where that particular tenant that they want to hack is, where that availability zone is. They were able to identify that location. Well, then they are presented with a controlled physical access. So it's not like we've identified the data center, we're just going to waltz in there. It's a controlled physical access, which means you have to be able to come up to it. You're probably going to get a retina scan. You're going to get a thumbprint. It's going to put you through a tunnel. It's going to weigh you. It's going to do several security checks. You're going to go through that tunnel where the door opens, you go into the tunnel, it closes, then another door opens, and so on and so forth. And you have several options of keypads and security codes that you have to enter before you can get through even to the lobby of the data center. So even if you've identified the location, then you have the problem of the controlled physical access. And then you have best-in-class data center security, which means, again, that multi-factor authentication, that thumb scan, that retina scan, the weighing, all of that comes into play in addition to, obviously, video surveillance. So in order for someone to worry about physical access, all of the AWS data centers are best-in-class data center security. They use discrete locations. They don't advertise their locations. So all of the stuff that you're used to in your hosted data center, think of, if not better, just as good as that. So depending on how well your hosted data center is, I've been to some that are state of the art. I mean, stuff that comes out of a James Bond movie in order for you to even get past the security. So from that perspective, Amazon does a fantastic job at it. Now, let's talk about servers and network infrastructure. So it's not enough for you to secure your servers or your network infrastructures from an access list perspective, from a username and password perspective. All of that is good. All of that is good at the logical level, right? But it is the responsibility of the data center provider. It is the responsibility of the cloud service provider to ensure that the hardware refresh cycle is on a best practice kind of period, so that every, let's say, 4 years or 3 years or 2 years or 6 months, whatever, depending on the component life cycle failure, that component is swapped out so that you're avoiding a failure. But not only failures, right? It's not fair to have your users, for example, on a 10-year-old server. So there are best practices put in place with Amazon where these components are refreshed on a cycle in order to make sure you're always up to date on the most advanced hardware, because that also helps from a security perspective. So the refresh cycle is crucially important when it comes when we're talking about security. They're properly decommissioned, especially as far as storage is concerned. So when we say properly decommissioned storage, it's not just a format, right? It's not just a deletion of the data that's on it. We're talking about a destruction of the actual storage of the hard drive, and that's really interesting and cool to see how they decommission hard drives and storage. It's always on monitoring, so they're monitoring every component that's running in their data center, whether it's servers, it's networking, etc. So from an operational perspective, they are monitoring every aspect of that data center. Now, just between us two, right? How many times do you really look at your monitoring system? Regardless of how advanced it is. If you're anything like me, I'm not looking at it until it's red, right? If it's not red, I'm not looking at it. Well, with Amazon, they can't afford to do that. So they're meticulous about how they monitor these systems, because that plays into their uptime. If they don't maintain their uptime, guess what happens? They get dinged on SLAs, which means they have to give stuff away for free, whether it's usage or payback or whatever. In our environment, we don't monitor it because, well, if it goes down, we might get slapped on the hand. We might not. We might be able to come up with 1,000 reasons why it wasn't our fault or whatever, right? It might not be our fault. But with Amazon, it is their business. So it is their business to make sure that it's always on and that they're monitoring it, because if it's not on, they're losing money. So that is the difference here, and the always on monitoring system is state of the art. Let's talk about security certifications and compliance. And the reason I want to bring up security certifications and compliance is because these certificates, these compliance or regulatory compliance achievements are not easy to achieve. You're not just going to waltz into those, right? You're not just going to get HIPAA compliance. And it's not one body that will certify you for HIPAA or for FIPS or for SOX, right? You're going to get different auditors for different certifications that walk into your data center and give you a list of what is acceptable in order for you to reach these regulatory compliance. If you've ever tried to certify your data center for any one of these, you'll know that every one of these on its own is a lot of work. It's a lot of work. So for Amazon to have this number of certification under its belts, they must have the process down to a science where they're able to provide the level of security that's acceptable to all of these organizations. So if you're at this point, you're still wondering if the cloud is secure or not, I'm asking you, does your data center have all of these security certifications? Now, you could jokingly say, well, I don't really care about these certifications, but that's not the point, right? These are government certifications with high standards. If your data center doesn't meet these, well, what makes your data center more secure than the AWS data center? I mean, that's really something to think about. Now, when we talk about security, security is a large topic, and we can talk about it for hours because there's so much that you can cover from a security perspective. It's not enough to have the security compliance, the regulatory compliance, and the certifications. If you don't have your server patched correctly, well, there you go. That's a security breach. Someone can just get in from there very easily off the internet. No matter how many certifications and compliance you have, no, that server is going to be compromised. So security is a very complicated conversation. But what I want to ease your mind is when we talk about the cloud, a lot of times the clouds are more secure than what we have on premises. Again, due to these certifications, due to the fact that they follow things down to a methodical way of doing things, whereas in our data centers, a lot of times we're not living and dying by that process or by these steps. So it's important to understand here and to note the security certifications and compliance that Amazon has. And I have a link here that we're going to visit in order to, if there's any updates, if they're adding any of them, and some other information that I want to show you as well. So if you visit this website here, the AWS compliance, you'll find all of the logos that we showed. And if you start to scroll down, you'll find all of the AWS assurance programs. You'll have, PCI DSS level 1, you'll have your SOX compliance, all of the stuff that I may have on my table or may not have had on my table that could be of interest to you. So if you're trying to put things into the cloud, into AWS, and you're wondering if they meet a particular regulatory requirement, this would be the page for you to visit and understand about the programs and even understand about, well, how did they achieve this? They'll give you the case studies on how they've achieved these particular certifications if that satisfies some of the questions that you may have. Down here, you'll find a lot of white papers and architecture as far as, again, how they're building these data centers, how they're becoming compliant. Again, there's so much information. There's the compliance webinars that they'll put you through. There's certifications and frequently asked questions. So my point of showing you this page is Amazon realizes that security is a barrier to entry into the cloud in general and into AWS in particular. And as a result, they're trying to offer as much resources as possible to your security officers, to you, to your business, in order to say, listen, we are going beyond the call of duty as far as security. We understand security is important. We're taking security very seriously, and here's everything that we're doing. So you can see just from this page, from all of the cases, the use cases, the white papers, the webinars, how much AWS takes security and compliance seriously. And you can even contact AWS again here for the compliance reports and certifications, just like I mentioned earlier, in order for you to get these reports to figure out what was the process that they got these certifications under. This is a really important page that you should visit if you have more questions around security, or if you wanted to find out again about the regulatory compliance that Amazon has achieved. Now, when it comes to security, especially in the cloud, it takes two to tango. And I mean that, right? So it's the concept of shared security responsibility. In order for you to have a secure environment, first, you need Amazon to do its part, but you also have to do your part. This is not one or the other. Any weak link in the chain can compromise the security. So there should be a trust level that Amazon is going to do its job, and then there should be what you need to do in order to secure your environment. So let's take a look at some of the things that Amazon should be responsible for and some of the things that you are supposed to be responsible for. So AWS's responsibility are for things like, for instance, your virtual host security, your storage security, your network security, your data center security, your database security. What does all of that mean, right? So AWS is going to ensure that your virtual host isn't going to be compromised. So if AWS has several tenants on the same server, it will ensure that the virtual hosts on the server are not going to be able to compromise one another. AWS is going to make that guarantee. It's going to build that wrapper around these virtual hosts and make sure that they're not going to talk to each other. Now, this concept shouldn't be scary to you. I mean, this is the whole concept of virtualization, right? So there's nothing to say that on your virtual server, let's say it's ESXi, you can have several tenants and each one has their own virtual machine. These virtual machines, if configured properly from a virtual networking perspective, will never talk to one another, right? Now, AWS is saying they will ensure virtual host security. Your servers will only communicate with your servers if you've granted them that security, and we'll talk about your responsibility. So they'll ensure virtual host security. They'll ensure that physical server security, right? That's taken care of. Storage security. Well, if your information, again, is going to be stored on the same storage array, for instance, with other companies, well, Amazon is going to ensure that it's building that wrapper around the storage bucket that you have provisioned for yourself, whereas your competitors or the other tenants that are on there are not able to access your storage bucket, your data. You have to be able to trust that Amazon is going to do that. And the same applies to network security. Amazon is going to guarantee that it's going to create that virtual networking environment they call virtual private cloud. And that virtual private cloud is yours, right? So they're going to ensure that the subnets, your IP addresses, all the traffic that is being communicated in that virtual private cloud is yours and yours alone. So no one from the outside is going to be able to compromise or share that. So again, that's based on Amazon's responsibility. Now, when I say that, that doesn't mean that you cannot overrule these security by some method, right? So while Amazon is ensuring that physical and that virtual security to an extent, if you go out and create a server and don't put any access lists on it or don't put any rules on it, and you expose that to the internet, well, sure, it's going to get compromised, but that's not AWS's responsibility. That's your responsibility for not taking the proper measures. So you can bypass some of these security measures that Amazon has put in place by, again, not being very attentive or not putting the right security processes in place. Data center security, we talked about that earlier. They're going to ensure data center security, secret locations, difficulty of accessing the data centers. I mean, even if someone accesses those data centers and sees all of these containers in there, well, now you have to get into the container. I mean, they make it so difficult where it's not really worth it accessing the data center from a physical perspective. You'll have better chances of figuring out if there are any servers to compromise from the internet. Database security, again, if you're leveraging some of the database services that Amazon offers, that means you probably are on the same database server with other tenants. They will ensure that your particular database is only communicating with your servers and others aren't able to compromise your database security. So that is their responsibility. But you also have a level of responsibility. You have a responsibility, first and foremost, to protect the AWS account security. If you create an Amazon account and you go out and give the root access, username and password to somebody, and your servers get compromised or your environment gets shut down, whose responsibility is that? It's not that the cloud isn't secure, it's that you didn't do your homework. Now, this is a true story. This actually was on the news and happened in New York some time ago, where a company that was responsible for backing up security information for its clients didn't pay a consultant or something to that extent. And that consultant had, guess what? The root username and password for the Amazon environment. Well, that consultant went in, shut down all servers, deleted them, had backup copies of those servers and held them ransom. Either you pay me this much or I'm deleting your data. They didn't pay and they ended up going bankrupt. But that's not a failure of the cloud. That's a failure of you not taking the proper measures. You don't give out the root username and password. The root username and password, once created, should never be used again. You should create roles and users and groups and responsibilities and the proper security best practices that you should be doing in your environment today. So AWS account security is very important, especially the usage of things like multi-factor authentication. Protect your API keys, right? Your application programming interface, right? So you have those secret keys, those tokens, those whatever, the host IDs, whatever they are, you need to be able to protect them. Because otherwise, then if you have a programmer that's doing work for you and you didn't pay that programmer and he's got access or she's got access to those API keys, well, guess what? They'll be able to create instances on your Amazon infrastructure all day long. They might not be able to bring your environment down. Maybe they don't have that level of security. But if they spin up 100 or 200 instances and let them run for a couple of days, for 24 hours, guess what? You're going to get hit with a pretty big bill. So the idea here is go back to the basics. Make sure your AWS account security, all of your AWS account security is secure, right? Use multi-factor authentication for best practices. Secure the API keys. Don't use your root account. Operating system. You should be able to secure the operating system, whether it's Linux, whether it's Microsoft, regardless. There are security best practices, there are patches that need to be implemented. There are Windows firewall that needs to be turned on with the proper ports configured. There are database security if you're hosting the database, if you're hosting SQL, for instance. You should be able to take the proper security measures for that database as if it was hosted on premises. Applications have their own usernames and passwords. Those should be implemented. So there are several layers of security within Amazon. Amazon is doing its part of logically separating you from other tenants that are on that same environment. But it is still your responsibility to secure your applications, your databases, your operating systems, and your user credentials. Data encryption, you can also do that. Authentication, that's crucial. Whether it's Active Directory, again, multi-factor authentication, how you're exposing your servers to the internet, and how the user's authenticating against these servers is very important. So again, the same best practices that you've taken on premises should be brought over to the cloud. Network integrity, all of these access lists and all of the things that go with it, all of these should be taken into account. You cannot assume that Amazon is going to do everything for you. There is a line where Amazon's responsibility ends and your responsibility begins. That's the beauty of this shared security responsibility model. Amazon is going to take care of all of the physical aspects, and it's going to take care of securing logically securing all of the components. But it is your responsibility to then secure whatever's in those logical components, whether it's an operating system, a database, an application, your user credentials, the authentication, which ports are open, which ports are not open, are people coming in over 443 or not. All of this stuff falls on you. So it's important to understand that in the cloud, there is this shared security responsibility. And it's important for you to understand it and be able to act against it. Otherwise, yes, the cloud will not be secure. But whose fault is that? It sure is not Amazon's fault. It's your fault if you're not understanding where Amazon's responsibility ends and where your responsibility begins in order for you to have a good match, a match made in heaven, essentially. Let's talk about security methods and connectivity. So how does Amazon secure stuff, or what are the tools that it gives me to secure stuff? Well, for starters, it gives you security groups. Well, security groups is the ability for you to specify which components have access to which components. And these components could be users that have access to servers, or users that have access to storage, or networking, or databases, or servers that have access to servers. Which servers have access to which servers? Maybe your database servers have access to your file servers, or your web servers have access to your application servers, and so on and so forth. It is a component that you put into a security group, and then you give access to another component. Security groups are very, very important, very, very effective method of using security. Now, you also have this concept of a virtual private cloud, VPC. Now, virtual private cloud, if we were to take it into enterprise lingo, would be virtual networking. This is what Amazon essentially calls virtual networking. When you start to do a virtual private cloud, now all of a sudden you have access to the access lists. So not only can you use security groups, but now you can have access to access lists. Why are access lists important? Well, access lists give you that additional level of security. For instance, you can say this subnet can speak to that subnet, or this IP address can speak to that IP address, and it can speak to that IP address on these specific ports, maybe port 443 only, maybe port 80 if this is exposed to the internet and no authentication is needed. Maybe, I don't know, you have multi-factor authentication and you need to open a specific port. So all of a sudden, you've just gained the power of access control lists, or the ACLs, that you can now also apply against your environment to increase the security. Now, access control lists, guess what? This isn't something new. This is something that you've already implemented on premises. So bringing those best practices, bringing the same types of questions you would ask on premises to the cloud in order to configure the environment is crucially important. You gain that with virtual private cloud. Direct Connect. Direct Connect is a really cool concept. So let's say you have certain components that you want to put somewhere in order to get high-speed connectivity into the Amazon cloud, right? So maybe your connectivity into Amazon is over a VPN or over the internet, and well, you know what? That's just not cutting it. Amazon has partnered with certain data centers, and these data centers that are not owned by Amazon have gigabit connectivity into availability zones. So if you place your equipment in some of these direct connect data centers, you now have gigabit connectivity into the Amazon cloud. So a good example of this would be a network access storage, right? Or network attached storage, a NAS device. If you have a lot of storage and you don't necessarily want to put all of that storage into the Amazon cloud, whether it's because of cost reasons, or whether it's because it's going to take forever to copy that information up to the Amazon cloud, you can leverage Direct Connect. Maybe you're architecting an application that requires an AS400, and you need to have that AS400 as close to the Amazon cloud as possible because performance might be a problem. Well, if you find a Direct Connect data center, you can put that AS400 there, you can put that NAS device there, or any other physical device that you want there, and all of a sudden, again, you've gained gigabit speed connectivity to the Amazon cloud. Import export. This is a pretty cool service that Amazon also offers. Let's say, again, let's take the example of the data that we were just talking about. Let's say you have, I don't know, a storage array that has 100 terabytes on it. And this 100 terabyte will take forever if you were to copy it, through the standard methods. What you can do is you can tell Amazon that you're sending them a storage array, and they'll specify the accepted formats of what you can send them. When you send them that data, they will ensure that they import it in a secure way. Conversely, let's say you've joined Amazon Web Services and for whatever reason, 6 months later or a year later or whatever, you don't like the service and you want to get out of the service. But hell, I have 500 terabytes of data on Amazon Web Services. Well, you can ask Amazon to export that. Again, there are specific formats that they'll abide by. They'll send it to you maybe on a USB drive or a USB key. I don't know, but they'll send it to you in a specific format where, again, now you can attach it to your network and import it on your end. So they'll be able to export it for you in a very, very rapid way. VPN access. So VPN access is interesting because this is where we get into hybrid cloud. So if you wanted to extend your on-premises network to the Amazon availability zone, to the Amazon cloud, you can build that VPN tunnel between your on-premises data center and the Amazon cloud, and you can even stretch your subnets. You'll have local connectivity to your resources via a VPN access into the Amazon cloud. Dedicated servers. So let's say, after everything that we've just talked about, you're still not comfortable with the Amazon security levels. Or let's say you have specific applications that have some kind of regulatory requirement where you cannot share that server with anyone else. It will void your license or whatever, right? You can request, for a price, of course, from Amazon to have a dedicated server that's running specifically your workloads and that you're not sharing with anyone. So what I want you to do is take a step back and take a look at all of these security methods and connectivity methods that are available to you. What Amazon's trying to do here is they're trying to remove all the barriers, trying to remove all of the reasons why not to go to the cloud by making it easy, even to the point where, well, I have an AS400 and that can't be virtualized, so I can't go to the cloud. Well, guess what? Put it in a direct connect data center and all of a sudden you can go to the cloud. Well, I need dedicated servers for certain workloads. Well, you can get that from Amazon as well. Again, you shouldn't be in a mindset of trying to convince yourself or building hurdles in front of yourself as far as why not to go to the cloud. What I want you to do is appreciate all of the services that are available to you, all the thought process that was put behind these services, all the effort, and try to figure out how hard it would be for you to maintain an environment like this, and can you leverage it to your advantage? Are there any benefits to you in taking advantage of all of the stuff that's available to you? I think you'll find that the answer is yes. Identity and access management, IAM. This is a slew of control that Amazon Web Services gives you. Let's go through it real quick. So they give you user and service management. You have the highest level of delegation possible in the form of users and groups, in the form of roles, in the form of federation. And what I mean by federation here is if you wanted to extend your Active Directory from on-premises into the cloud, you can do that. With federated services, Active Directory federated services, you can do that. Roles is where you can create a set of privileges that you're putting under a role and then you're assigning a user to that role. So anybody in that role can then get access to a specific set of privileges. These privileges might be the ability to manage storage and manage network and create virtual machines or virtual instances as they're called with Amazon Web Services. So it gives you very high levels of delegation that you can control with identity and access management. You then have access to controls to AWS resources. So again, you can do that via users and services. You can do that via the ability to set security on every component of AWS. Every component of AWS can have security against it in the forms of security groups or ACLs. Also, all of that can be also controlled very, very granularly. You have multi-factor authentication. So if you were to do multi-factor authentication on premises, it would require a lot of configuration, a lot of design. It would require cost. You would have to incur software costs. You would have to configure it. Well, with Amazon Web Services, you can be up and running on multi-factor authentication in a few minutes. They give that to you for free. Go ahead, use it. Just make sure everything is secure. Again, multi-factor authentication is needed. It's important in order to, again, make it even more difficult for someone to try to brute force into username and password. Maybe they can crack a password, but a password and a multi-factor authentication. And this comes in several different forms, right? It can come in a key fob, a secure ID key fob. It can come off of your phone that can give you a number that changes randomly every 10 seconds or 20 seconds or 60 seconds, whatever it is. So multi-factor authentication should be part of your best practices in the identity and access management control whenever you're using AWS. And finally, API keys. So the API keys are important because you need them. Your developers might need them. You might need them to configure your applications so that the applications can speak to other applications and be able to perform certain tasks. So APIs are important. The misuse of API is what could pose a security threat. So if you're misplacing those keys, you're misplacing those secret keys, then it's a problem. So be aware that you also have API access, and API access is important. You also have the ability to retrieve passwords using SSL. So again, in order for you bring up an instance, a Windows instance, for instance, you bring up a Windows instance and you're trying to get the administrator password. The only way for you to retrieve that administrative password is through SSL. You're going to make an SSL request and it's going to do that. If you're trying to gain access to SSH, again, that's also secured with SSL. You can clear out your passwords on reboot or on boot. Again, if you have an image of a Windows machine up on Amazon, for instance, or if you're using one of the Amazon instances. Now, that Amazon instance probably has a default password, but the default password that the first person that created isn't the password that you're going to get. On boot, Amazon is going to automatically wipe that password and issue a new one via SSL. Do you see the level of complexity to what extent they're going in order to protect security? Now, if you need more information, the AWS IAM page is very helpful. Let's take a look at it, and then we're going to log into the console, and I'm going to show you where you can go to get access to IAM. So from this page, again, there's a lot of information around how you can use IAM, right? There's even a video here that's pretty useful for a high-level overview that you could take a look at as well. Functionality, they give you all of this examples, use cases. It's just filled with information. Now, the section that I like is the IAM best practices. And this is where they go into best practices on every aspect that they support, from users to groups to permissions to auditing, etc. That you can also go through and learn around how to use best practices. Now, for the first time, what I want to do is I want to log into the Amazon Management Console. We haven't done that yet. We're going to do that later. But I wanted to show you where IAM is and what are some of the functionality and the use cases that you have with it. We're going to do a proper overview and walkthrough of the Amazon Management Console later, but I wanted to show you here, if you're at this point and you just want to try IAM, or if you want to create a free account, maybe get ahead of me a little bit. You can obviously create a free account from here. There's call to action to create a free account everywhere. But I already have an account. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to enter my super secret password here. And once I do that, you'll see that I am directed to this particular page. And you can always get access to this page by just clicking on that icon on the top left here, which is the Amazon logo essentially. Now, in order for you to get access to identity and access management, very simple, very straightforward. There it is. Bada bing, bada boom, you click on it. And you'll see that you have the ability of creating groups. You have the ability of creating users. You have the ability of creating roles. Everything is just here at your fingertips, essentially, for you to create. Now, you also have security statuses as far as delete your host keys. I haven't accessed this in a while, so they'll give you those security measures. They'll try as much as possible to stay on top of things and to alert you. But remember what we talked about earlier. Security is a shared responsibility. So it's not enough for them to do everything. You have to also be aware of the limitations of the environment. You have to be aware of what your responsibility is in order for you to configure it properly. There's just so much at your disposal that you can take advantage of and make these environments rock solid. There's a reason why AWS is the 800-pound gorilla in cloud. It's because of all of this flexibility. All of this, keep in mind, you're able to do all of this self-service. You don't have to configure everything on the back end. Just imagine how much it took to get to this point where this granularity as far as the identity and access management is built in. Well, you're able to do it on your own. So take advantage of this, appreciate what's been in here, and take advantage of it for sure, because that will be the differentiator between building a rock solid cloud environment or not. Let's recap what we've learned. We started by talking about the physical access. We talked about the fact that Amazon, by default, they are going to make physical access difficult, right? They're going to use the best-in-class security. They're going to use discrete locations. They're going to have video surveillance. They're going to have several levels of authentication, whether it's retinal or thumb or weight or all of the security that you're used to in a best-in-class data center are available within Amazon from a physical security perspective. We talked about the security certifications and accreditations that they have, and the fact that they've amassed all of these security certifications and accreditation not by mistake, and these require a lot of work. So these should also be another point in their camp, basically, or another factor in why you should be able to trust Amazon from a security perspective. Shared security responsibility, I think we killed this one to death by explaining the fact that there's a responsibility that falls on Amazon as far as security is concerned, and there's a huge responsibility that falls on us as tenants, as people that are using these services, to understand first what Amazon's security is, what they're doing, where they draw the line, and where our responsibility begins. This particular thing that I just mentioned is the thing that will make or break an environment, for you to know where your responsibility begins and where it ends. Security methods and connectivity. We talked about the fact that Amazon offers a lot of security methods and connectivity, from security groups to virtual private clouds to direct connect to VPN. All of the stuff that we talked about as far as how to, again, make your environment secure. And then we talked about identity and access management and how you can extend your Active Directory, for instance, and use Active Directory federated systems. The fact that you can do highly delegated environments with users, with groups, with permissions. All of that can be done. Multi-factor authentication, all of API security. All of this stuff can be done using identity and access management. And we also took a small walkthrough through the Amazon Management Console, and I showed you where you would go to access IAM. Finally, I hope this module was very informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.